talk about our bioethics portion of Intrinsic Evils, Dr. Slyke.
Thank you, Gabe. I want to say my daughter's in this program, so I've heard quite a bit about it here. We're very, very pleased that it's very well run and that there's a group of solid young people that are involved. So, and I know that Gabe and Randall are doing a great job and all your volunteers. So, appreciative of the quality of this program. I would much rather talk about the two topics that the preceding speakers addressed because that was pretty interesting for me. I teach both sacraments and angels. Actually, I have a class called Angels, Demons, Deliverance, and Exorcism that I teach at, I'll be teaching it at the University of Dallas next semester. I've taught it in other places as well. And there was a fascinating exchange at the end about when the battle in heaven took place and the demons fell. And you're both right, by the way, because it was before man was created. It's generally thought, if you look at St. Augustine would put it on the first day of creation because God creates light, and then he separates light from darkness. He doesn't create the darkness. And Augustine's interpretations, St. Augustine of Hippo, died in 430. His interpretation is that the darkness, that represents the fallen angels. God separates them because there's a sin at the very dawn of time. But it is in time, because if you read St. Thomas Aquinas, died 1274, you'll see that he's called the angelic doctor. According to St. Thomas, angels do exist in a sort of time. So, although it's not before time, it's before the creation of man. But based upon a revelation that the angels were told that there would indeed be the incarnation or the creation of man. Various fathers disagree on exactly what the devil learned, but it was about jealousy and pride and anger, either about the incarnation or the creation of human beings. Fun stuff, isn't it? Let's get on to what I'm supposed to talk about now. Yeah. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about human cloning and the question of stem cell research, and they're related, and that's why they're lumped together here. So I'm going to begin with a true-false question. So you've got a 50-50 chance of getting this right. Okay? True or false? The Catholic Church is against stem cell research. False. Hey, you're good. Sharp through. Okay, that's right. Because in fact, the Catholic Church is entirely in favor of adult stem cell research. What it's against is embryonic stem cell research. And if we're to say, what's wrong with embryonic stem cell research? It's kind of easy. The same thing that's wrong with abortion. It involves killing human beings in the very early stages of their development. Okay? But what I want to do in the time that I have today is address 6 topics. I want to start with stem cell research that's actually good and not morally objectionable. In other words, the very kind that the Catholic Church would support, and in fact does support. Just last November, at the Vatican, there was a conference, an international conference of scientists and philosophers and theologians on adult stem cell research. An international conference, actually promoting it. This conference was sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Culture, which deals with a lot of scientific issues. And that same council, in fact, actually collects donations for supporting adult stem cell research. So the Catholic Church is very much pro-science, very much pro-stem cell research when you're dealing with the kinds that are morally acceptable and good. Now, what I'm going to do in this time is 6 topics. First of all, we're going to look at the adult stem cell research. Then we're going to look at iPS cells. This is kind of a new thing, closely related, but it's also perfectly acceptable from a moral point of view. Then we'll address the question of embryonic stem cell research. That's 3. So we've got 3 types of cells we're going to deal with. Then 4, we're going to talk about the related issue of cloning and how that comes in when you're talking about stem cell research. 5, we're going to address the moral implications of, especially the problem with embryonic stem cell research. And 6, I want to address what I call a slippery slope, which will be the kind of ultimate results if you accept these things, and if you have a society and a government that accepts them and that even encourages them and promotes them. It leads to very dangerous ends. So let's begin, though, by asking what in the world is a stem cell. So we're going to just start with a stem cell. We're going to deal with a lot of biological issues here. So stem cells are biological cells that are found in organisms like mammals, like us, that can divide and differentiate into diverse specialized cell types. So they're kind of seed cells, if you will, that can divide into other things. And they're capable of renewing themselves and dividing for a long period of time. In other words, they're very effective, and what people are looking at them for is how can you heal? How can you heal heart tissue, lung tissue, brain tissue? Can you transplant organs? Can you actually create organs that will be accepted into people who need transplants? And stem cells hold a lot of promise for actually healing people with serious diseases, including Parkinson's, heart disease, etc., etc.
So,
because of their character of dividing and growing, yes, and healing.
I was going to ask, are they like white blood cells? Or
They're not white blood cells. They're a very specific type, and that's where we're getting
do they do the function of white blood cells?
White blood cells fight infection and disease. This is more like what happens if you lose some brain cells. Okay, can they grow back? And that's where a stem cell holds promise, because it could actually grow into brain cell tissue. That's the idea. So it's a little different from a white blood cell. Now, there are basically 2 kinds of stem cell. You've got adult stem cells, and then you have embryonic stem cells. So embryonic stem cells are taken from human embryos or human fertilized eggs very, very early, as soon as they begin to divide. In that early stage, first week after conception, or after the egg and the sperm come together, you have a division that happens right away. What happens with embryonic stem cells is it's right there at the beginning. And these scientists who use them they stop the process of division, and they take the embryonic stem cells out. That's in the first week of the existence of this human life. That's where they get them. Any other kind of stem cell we would qualify as adult stem cell. And this comes from various parts of the body. We have stem cells in our brain. We have stem cells in various kinds of muscle tissues. Bone marrow is a great source of stem cells. And stem cells from adults have been used often to treat bone diseases, especially bone marrow diseases. And then finally, there's one more kind of cell, which is not exactly either of these, but it can be made like an embryonic stem cell research, and it's called an iPS cell, which can be made into a cell that effectively works like an embryonic stem cell, but is not taken from an embryo. You don't have to destroy a human life in order to get it. It can come from your skin. Okay, and that's a very important development. So let's look. First of all, we're going to look at adult stem cells. Definition. An adult stem cell is thought to be an undifferentiated cell found among differentiated cells in a tissue or organ. So an organ is composed of a bunch of different kinds of cells. But you'll find within them, scientists have found, some of these cells that are actually capable of becoming the various parts of the organ, various cells that compose the organ. An organ like a heart or your liver. And adult stem cells, it's thought that if you find it in the heart, that it can only become some kind of heart tissue. That's what it would develop into, some kind of heart cell, some kind of heart tissue. You can find them also in umbilical cords. Umbilical cords are a very important source of adult stem cells, because it's not from the earliest stage of development. That would still qualify as adult. These are entirely morally unobjectionable. There's no moral problem with dealing with adult stem cells at all. It's completely uncontroversial. And it has been used successfully. Adult stem cells have been used, let me see here, to do what? To restore or repair damaged hearts and organs, to restore sight, to treat cancer, to cure diabetes, to heal burns, and to stop the march of degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's even. So they've actually been used in order to move forward on these various diseases, actually developing cures for these diseases. And they've been used successfully. They're also used to heal muscle tissue in hurt horses. So that's not a human application, obviously, but you see that it can restore muscle as well. All these are adult stem cell research advantages. And the thing with the adult stem cells is, if you're the sick person, let's say you have Parkinson's, and you need to restore some kinds of tissues that have been have degenerated, the stem cell would come from you. You're the one who donates the stem cell. And then the scientists, the doctors, can use these cells to grow new tissues. They put them back into your body. And the huge advantage is there's no reaction against those cells because they're your own cells. Now typically in a transplant, let's say that you have you need a liver transplant or something like that. A lot of times your body will reject that liver. The person who receives the immune system will attack it because it looks like to your body, your white blood cells think that it's some kind of foreign thing that might be dangerous. So what happens is after a transplant, a lot of people need to take these immunosuppressant drugs which suppress their immune system so it doesn't fight the new organ. But that then, of course, leaves them susceptible to all kinds of sicknesses and other problems that could come in. So one of the chief advantages of adult stem cells is your immune system won't reject them because they came from you if you need this type of therapy. Now, let's now move on to iPS cells. This is the second type of cell. Oh, and the other advantage, let me just state again, adult stem cells have been used and are being used to actually cure people successfully now. As a matter of fact, they've been used in bone marrow transplants for 50 years. Adult stem cells have been used for 50 years. So they actually are used and are successful in a variety of applications. Next are iPS cells. What in the world is that? It is an induced pluripotent stem cell. Wow, that's big. Let's just call it iPS. Just last week, so this was October 8th, 2 scientists were granted the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work on this type of cell, which is absolutely groundbreaking. John B. Gordon and Shinya Yamanaka of Japan. These are the 2 scientists, in case you're wondering. And what they did is they showed that you could take various cells from the adult body, and they actually were working originally with skin cells from mice. And of course, you use the animals first, and you try human beings. And what you do is you can take that cell, and by introducing certain kind of modifications with it, I believe they use viruses, and don't ask me exactly how this happens, but you introduce certain kind of modifications, and you alter the genetic capacity of it just a wee bit, and you can wind up with stem cells. Okay? And see, because one of the disadvantages with stem cells is your body doesn't have that many, and they're hard for the scientists to find. But now, what they've done is they've come up with a way that your body can supply potentially unlimited source of stem cells, because they'll take full adult cells, they'll genetically alter them a bit, and then voila, you have stem cells that have come from your own body. Those are called iPS cells. Yes?
How would you genetically alter anything?
From what I understand, they introduce a virus that changes something about the cell, but I have to say I don't fully understand this. I'm a theologian, not a nuclear or a biologist, or what's this, physiologist, whatever these things are. There's a reason why these guys got this Nobel Prize and I didn't, okay? But let me put it this way, if you want to learn more about it, this fellow, and I named his name, don't ask me to pronounce it again, but if you look up Nobel Prize winners, stem cells, you'll find him. He has a full website already, just a few days after he received the award. The group for which he works put up a full website with all kinds of explanations about what he's doing. And potentially, the scientists are pretty excited about it because it could entirely replace the need for using embryonic stem cells. I mean, there is no need for using them, but it could entirely replace the function that they serve in research now. Okay, So there's that potential, and it may indeed render the use of embryonic stem cells entirely unnecessary, even from the viewpoint of a crazy mad scientist. So IBS cells are very promising. Now let's move to embryonic stem cell research, because the IBS cells and the adult cells are entirely morally licit and not only accepted by the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church supports and promotes and encourages research on them and medical therapies that are developed from them. But now we move to embryonic stem cell research, which in fact is intrinsically morally disordered, which means there's no justification for ever doing this. It is always and everywhere wrong. It is always and everywhere an evil. So, judging from the media, you would think that embryonic stem cell research is the only kind there is, because they're very into promoting this, and it's hard to say exactly why it's so popular with them. But just from sitting in this room, you already know that it's not the only kind out there. In fact, we have these other kinds that are even more promising. Stem cell research using embryos, the problem with it is that it requires destroying the embryos. Even though the embryonic stem cells have never been used to treat or cure any diseases at all. In other words, their potential for bringing about cures is entirely theoretical. It's entirely speculative. Nobody has been helped with anything that came from an embryonic stem cell. Okay, so keep that in mind. People have been actually helped by adult stem cell use. Nobody's yet been helped in any way by the use of embryonic stem cells. Okay? And one of the problems with them is they have the potential to become any part of the body, any kind of tissue, but they can't be controlled. The scientists can't control what kind of tissue they'll become. So when they begin to multiply and divide and turn into things, there's a high probability that what they turn into is not what the scientist wants. So you don't want things put back in your brain or your spinal cord that are becoming parts of liver or lungs, to give you an idea of the potential for really bad effects. So they haven't even begun to experiment on human beings with diseases with anything that comes from embryonic stem cell research. Okay, so it has of yet yielded no fruits for curing people with actual diseases and sicknesses and injuries. So, what else do we want to say about that? It hasn't been proven fruitful, but why is it evil? And I'm going to give 2 reasons why we know that it's intrinsically evil. The first is, and this is its central problem, at the heart of it, in order to use these embryonic stem cells for research, the scientists have to destroy a 5-day-old human being. So 5 days after this egg is fertilized or comes into existence, they have to destroy it. So basically, it's an abortion after 5 days. And the proposal to destroy a young human being, is always and everywhere wrong. It's always and everywhere evil. Because human life is sacred, and it is a human life, from the moment of conception, from the moment it begins to exist, until the moment of natural death. So the second problem, though, is that how these embryos come into being. Many of them come into being through in vitro fertilization or cloning. Okay, and that's where cloning enters the picture. And in vitro fertilization is extremely problematic because it results in so many human beings, so many fertilized eggs, so very early stage of human life, actually being destroyed or being set aside for purposes of destruction, basically, if they're going to be used in this research. So it also involves in vitro fertilization and cloning. So with that, I should get to what cloning is. Cloning 101. Here we go. Are you ready? This is the process of human cloning, at least. It begins with an egg. So this is an egg that's taken from a human womb, which means, of course, that some kind of invasive procedure has to be done, whereby you have an egg donor, who then somebody has to go in her body and take out the eggs. So that in itself that's not a therapeutic intervention. In other words, it's a kind of surgery or procedure that's not for the health of the person. So you've got a problem with that already. That you have to actually get real human eggs from real human women. But then what happens is they take a cell from whomever it is that they want to clone. Okay, say you want to clone Russell Crowe or something. I don't know who you want to clone. Pardon? Chuck Norris. All right. Let's clone Chuck Norris. Although I'm pretty sure he would not agree with this procedure. So you take a Chuck Norris cell, and what you do is you take the nucleus out of the cell. So they take the nucleus out of the cell, and then they basically insert the nucleus into the egg, and it becomes an asexual means of fertilizing the egg, because what you wind up with then is the beginning of human life. And then they zap it with a little bit of an electric shock, and the cells start dividing. That's how they do human cloning. Now there are two types of human cloning, or two, you could say, purposes behind human cloning. The first one is reproductive. So let's say you want your baby to be Chuck Norris. Because if it were successful, that would be the result. This child would have the exact same DNA as Chuck Norris. I don't know if you'd be able to put him through the same training programs in firearms and martial arts, but he would have the same DNA. So out he comes, and you've given birth to Chuck Norris. Now, most people see problems with that. I think if you've ever seen a movie that involves cloning, it's probably a horror film or a film about a futuristic dystopian society where you really don't want to live. Okay, so movie makers at least are kind of onto this idea that cloning seems a little bit potentially dangerous to society and human life. But let me add that no human being has ever successfully been cloned in this reproductive purpose. In other words, we have not yet had a human being produced by cloning that actually was born and survived. And we should probably be thankful about that. Which actually, and it may not even be possible. Just keep this in mind. It may not even be possible. Scientists think if they keep experimenting, eventually they're going to succeed. But that's not a guarantee. And one of the problems is if they do succeed, what are you going to wind up with? You know, like Rosemary's Baby or some kind of monster or something like that. You don't know what will be the results. Yeah.
Okay. So, but they've tried to do it on people? They've tried to clone people?
I'm sure that Hitler scientists tried stuff like that, but I don't know of anything, any kind of legitimate science that's allowing it, and most countries, in fact, forbid even trying, including the United States. Reproductive cloning is actually illegal in any state that has a law about cloning.
What about Dolly?
Of human beings. Of human beings. Reproductive cloning of human beings. Let me say human beings, yeah. Okay, so if you want to talk about the cloning of sheep and animals, they've had a lot of success with frogs, okay? But remember, Pharaoh's magicians, they could reproduce frogs too. So don't worry about the frogs. Whenever they try mammals, the success rate is actually abysmal. Out of about 100, the rate is, out of about 100 attempts, they might have one success. Okay, and the problem is that when those animals are born, they tend to have severe defects, including they're very susceptible to disease. Gigantism is a big defect among these. In other words, they just grow way too big, way too fast, which I guess is what, you know, if you're Count Dooku, you want that in the Clone Wars. But the problem is that that's not good for the creature, and it dies. It dies young. Dolly, of course, is dead. She was the first sheep to be cloned. Okay. And again, it was the same kind of process for any mammal. You take an egg from a female, and then you take the nucleus out of a cell from another, and then you put it in there. Okay. So let me just, I'm going to quote Cardinal Trujillo, who is he's actually the prefect of he's the president, or prefect, of the Pontifical Council for the Family. Okay. And this is what he says about cloning. When scientists allude to cloning in the strict sense of the term, they usually identify it with nuclear transfers. So that's what I'm talking about here. You take the nucleus of a cell, and then you put it into an egg. Fertilization, properly so called, then, is replaced by the fusion of a nucleus taken from a somatic cell of the individual one wishes to clone. So this is not sexual reproduction. This is reproduction without the male sperm. So since the nucleus of the somatic cell contains the whole genetic inheritance, the individual obtained possesses, except for possible alterations, which you don't even know what happened to it in the process, it possesses the genetic identity of the nucleus's donor. It is this essential genetic correspondence with the donor that produces in the new individual the somatic replica or copy of the donor itself. Okay, so Chuck Norris, in other words. Okay, so you have a nucleus from a cell of Chuck Norris. You wind up with the exact genetic replica of Chuck Norris. Or what is it, Boba Fett? Is it Boba Fett? Is that the guy's name? Yeah. He's the, okay. So Boba Fett, they took some Boba Fett cells. But you have to realize if they're doing that by modern methods in Star Wars, that means for every single one of the clones that's born, they had to get an actual egg from an actual human female. And you know, in the evil empire, I doubt they were donors. You know what I mean? And that actually is one of the potential problems of this, is how are you going to, when you start taking parts out of people for these scientific purposes that has no benefit to the people, okay, then that already is morally questionable. So other moral problems with cloning, this is from a statement by Wilton D. Gregory, Bishop of the USCCB here in the United States. He says, human cloning violates fundamental ethical and moral norms and is to be condemned unequivocally, which means there's no reason you could ever say that there's anything good about human cloning. Human cloning, again. So I'm not talking about animals, I'm not talking about plants, which have been cloned successfully. I'm talking about human cloning. Human cloning, continuing with Bishop Gregory, does not treat any disease but turns human reproduction into a manufacturing process by which human beings are mass-produced to preset specifications. The cloning procedure is so dehumanizing that some scientists want to treat the resulting human beings as subhuman, creating them solely so they can destroy them for their cells and tissues. Okay, so where this is where it's going, you have to realize, and this is what I call the slippery slope. The idea is that if we can clone human beings, then we can, let's say you have heart disease. So we're going to take some of your cells, we're going to take the nucleus out, we're going to clone you, and then this now existing human being, okay, that's comes to be in a petri dish, will be actually implanted into a female, an actual human woman who winds up being a surrogate mother. And at a certain point, you take out the fetus, you take out the child, and then you extract the heart. You see, and that we could call that embryo farming. And you better believe these scientists are talking about this seriously as one of the implications of cloning.
How would the mother willingly agree to that?
There is no, well, the mother, there is no mother. See, that's what they've done, is they separated the reproductive process from an actual mother. Pardon?
Like, how would they get the baby out of what?
The surrogate mother. Well, they get the baby, you'll have some anonymous egg donor. It doesn't matter who gives the egg.
Yeah,
Surrogate mother is like if they have that embryo right now, they're gonna put it in you, and your body's naturally gonna develop.
yeah, see, how would the woman willingly, like...
Because they'll say, look, I'll give you $10,000 if you'll carry this baby around for 6 months.
People are desperate.
Yeah. People do this. There already are surrogate mothers, by the way. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are. It's called heterologous in vitro fertilization, where somebody will be actually, if there's a woman who doesn't think she can carry a baby, and she wants to have a baby, and she wants the baby to be from her own egg, then there will be in vitro fertilization, and then the baby will be implanted into the womb of a surrogate mother who will be paid just to carry the baby around until it grows enough to be born. So that's a surrogate mother. That's actually happening right now. So let me move to the moral principles. What is the fifth commandment?
No, not kill.
Okay, that's an easy one. And this is a negative precept. And if you know the difference between a negative precept and a positive precept, a negative precept means this is what you can't do. It is universally binding. It is never morally good or justifiable to kill an innocent human being. always and everywhere, no matter what your intention. So you may have the greatest intentions in the world. You may think, I'm going to cure cancer, I'm going to cure Parkinson's. Thousands or millions of people are going to benefit from the death of this one human being. It's still an evil. It's always and everywhere intrinsically evil to take the life of an innocent human being. And I think we can all agree that a human being anywhere under the age of reason is innocent. Okay? I know whatever you think about your 2, 3-year-old toddlers, brothers, sisters, we have some, they're not yet really capable of mortal sin. So as annoying as they are, as destructive as they are, as dangerous as they may be, Marilyn can show you bite marks from her 3-year-old sister on her arm tonight, they're still innocent, okay? They're still innocent. And when they're in the womb, when they're first conceived, they're definitely innocent. There's no doubt about that. So it's always and everywhere then evil, no matter what your intentions, no matter what you think will be the end or the purpose, it's always evil to kill an innocent human being. And that is the basic reason why there's a problem with embryonic stem cell research, because this is a human being. Whether it comes into existence through in vitro fertilization or whether it comes into existence through cloning, either way, once it begins to live, it is a human being. As soon as those cells start to divide, it is a human being. It is nothing else. It can be nothing else other than a human being. And we know, as Catholics, that every human being has certain rights. We're endowed with rights. And what do these rights include? Every human being has a right to life and to physical integrity from the moment of conception until natural death. Okay? The right to life is actually fundamental. If I deny you your right to life, none of your other rights matter, do they? Okay? So the right to life is absolutely fundamental. And also we have the rights of a child, and if you get into the documents of the church, and you'll see that it defends the right of a child to actually be born into a family with a real mother and a real father. Children have other rights than the right to life. They actually have a right to be conceived and brought up in the world by its parents. And now I'm going to quote from a document called Donum Vitae. Donum Vitae was written by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Human life is sacred because from the beginning it involves the creative action of God, and it remains forever in a special relationship with the Creator, who is its sole end. God alone is the Lord of life, from its beginning until its end. No one can under any circumstances claim for himself the right directly to destroy an innocent human being. No one under any circumstances. And this is not something, by the way, it's not just Catholics that see that. Anybody who is morally upright or not deceiving themselves will see the truth to that statement. This is part of the universal moral law. It's not part of just it's not solely a Catholic teaching. It is immoral, therefore, to produce human embryos intended for exploitation as disposable biological material. It is absolutely immoral, and it twists one's moral sensibility to treat an embryo, which is a human being, as disposable biological material. And that's where we get to my final point, which is about the slippery slope. What is this slippery slope? Because you may say, this sounds to me like something that concerns, human beings that are still in petri dishes or in test tubes or whatever, and then a bunch of scientists. But in fact, it does and it will have, I would argue, a very direct and real implication, which potentially could negatively impact all of our lives. And I want to discuss this from two perspectives. The first is, I'm calling it eggheads, and then the second would be governance. Okay? So when I say eggheads, I'm talking about the people who are sitting in universities like Oxford and Yale, and they're ethicists or they're moral philosophers who are actually coming up with justifications for doing these kinds of research. These are the same people that will argue that it's okay to kill, to abort babies. They'll come up with all kinds of specious arguments like, well, the woman's choice, that just avoids the issue entirely. They'll start asking questions about when brain waves come in or when the heart beats or whatever. In other words, they want to split hairs to say that at a certain point, a human life can be treated as inhuman and can be killed. And the problem there is there's no place to draw the line. Once you concede that principle, that some of these people really truly believe, scientists, philosophers, the people that are sitting in the White House right now, truly believe this principle. The problem with it is, where do you draw the line? You say, it's before the cells begin to what? Differentiate past this blastoplast stage or something like that. Maybe it's the first week. But if you're willing to take their lives in the first week, why not the second? If you're willing to take their lives in the second week, why not the third? And if you're willing to take their lives in the womb, why not take the lives of infants that are born if they're unwanted? The Romans had no problem with this. If you had a baby and you didn't want it, you just set it out and let it die, or somebody else would take it and make it a slave or a prostitute. That's what the Romans did. That's what the Greeks did. That's where we're going with this, because you've basically denied the intrinsic value of human life, and that human beings always have a right to life. And that's a fundamental right. There's no place to draw the line. And you'll see these philosophers, and I'm not kidding you, you can read what they write. They write it in books, they put it on websites. They will argue that there's nothing wrong with infanticide. They'll argue that, then they begin to split hairs, and they'll say, well, the child doesn't really become self-aware until such and such an age, and until it becomes self-aware, you can kill it. Okay? But again, why draw the line there? Because you basically denied the fundamental right to life of every human being. On the other end, it's quite obvious that these people are going to support euthanasia. Well, what about when they get so old that they don't quite have self-awareness? Well, we can put them to death then too. And then any time in between, everything becomes vulnerable. Human life at every stage, for any reason, because you've basically said that for a greater good, I can take a human life. And that's a slippery slope. That's exactly what was going on with the Nazis in Germany. The Nazis in Germany were doing horrible experimentations on human beings all the time because they basically denied that everybody had the right to life. And they were messing with people like this. The communists too. You don't have a right to life because you disagree with my politics. There's no place where that ends once you deny that every human being has a right to life. So that's what the slippery slope is about, and that's why I wanted to mention that there are implications of this in the political sphere, which are very, very dangerous, very, very bad. Again, in Nazi Germany, it wasn't just old people that were killed. That's where they started with euthanasia. Okay? They did start with that. They were doing experiments on pregnant women. They were killing political opponents, Jews, whomever they didn't like. So human life either has an intrinsic value or it doesn't. Okay? And we as Christians know it does because it's created by God, and God alone has the determinative power over life and death. So we can't usurp that. All right. Let me end with a quotation from Evangelium Vitae, which is Pope John Paul II. He says, the moral condemnation of these things that we've been talking about regards procedures that exploit living human embryos and fetuses, sometimes specifically produced for this purpose by in vitro fertilization, either to be used as biological material or as providers of organs or tissue for transplants in the treatment of certain diseases. The killing of innocent human creatures, even if carried out to help others, constitutes an absolutely unacceptable act. And when he says absolutely, he means that quite literally. There is never a way to justify this, even to help others. And those are the principles on which we have to stand. Thank you very much.
Questions while he was talking, and he actually answered all of them except for one, but kind of works, kind of not. If human cloning were ever actually to be able to work, would that cloned person have a soul?
It would. If it's a human being, it has a soul, right? And that's kind of the basic principle. The reason why human life has an intrinsic value is because a human being is body and soul. In other words, we have a spiritual or immaterial part as well as a material part. And no other animal has that. Okay? And the key is that soul is immortal. And the soul, philosophically, theologically, as soon as you begin to live, you have a soul, because the soul is the animating principle of the body.
There was a priest who was giving a homily one time, and he just made the point that always stuck with me, that we're not bodies with souls, we're like souls with bodies. Like, we are initially a spiritual being that God has made.
Absolutely, yeah. We're body and soul from the moment we first come into existence. And the separation of the body from the soul, that's what happens at death. That's unnatural. That's a result of sin. But that's not permanent, because the body and the soul will be reunited at the resurrection. Because remember, there's the resurrection of the just and there's the resurrection of the damned. So, but everybody gets their bodies back. The souls, because we were created as a creature that is one being with these two parts, the physical and the spiritual. That's right.
Why would you take an embryonic stem cell if you could just take an adult stem cell?
Yeah, the main reason that the scientists give is that it's easier to culture them. The embryonic stem cells are a lot easier you can get them to live and to actually last for quite some time in these petri dishes. And what they do is, if they're successful, they'll wind up with, they can fill a room with these petri dishes. Now, a lot of them are not successful, but let's say they're successful 1 out of 100 times. They can create a line that then they'll use for experimentation for all kinds of things. Whereas adult stem cells do not do quite so well necessarily in being cultured, and you can't continue to use them because, see, they're hoping that if they get the embryonic stem cells to work, they'll be able to use them in anyone, right? But the adult stem cells can only be used, or most effectively be used, in the donor himself. Okay? So there are those couple of reasons. But again, the problem is that they have to always keep those embryonic stem cells from becoming what they don't want them to become, because they have the potential to become any part of the body. So there's a very strong chance that they'll become cancers in the body, or they'll lead to cancer in the body. And the only human, there was one company last year, I believe, that actually had approval to start trying to experiment with embryonic stem cells in adults who had problems. And after a month, they called off the project. The results were not looking good. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm not quite sure. I kind of touched on it in what you said. In the case of, I believe it was adult stem cells, I'm not quite sure if it was the
IPS, yeah.
You said that the cells, once implanted, have the ability to multiply quickly. How do they stop? Because I know that's the same way that cancer works. That these cells are not able to stop, and therefore they run and things like that, and can kill you because they get too big. But
Right.
how do the cells know how to stop?
Yeah, well, I think the idea with the adult stem cells, again, is that they actually come from the organ. You want to bring them, you want to create them, get them from the organ of the individual that needs to be repaired.
Right.
And then you put it back, and they're kind of doing what they naturally do. So I don't know how it is that, you know, when a 3-year-old bites through and draws blood, right? Your skin has the ability to heal itself. How does it know when to stop? I don't know. I have no idea how it knows when to stop, so it doesn't just keep growing, you know, so I don't wind up with this big chunk of skin sticking. I don't know, but it does. But it's a great question. But it also shows how a lot of people kind of think, oh, there's this unstoppable march of progress. If they keep working with these things, they're going to be able to cure everything. And we have no reason to think that. The technology is just not there. There are some things that can be cured in some instances, but in other cases it doesn't work, and you wind up with cancerous growths. Again, but they haven't even tried the embryonic stem cells in human beings to help them, because right now they know that the results will not be good.
Right. Thank you.
You talked about surrogate mothers, but I heard that there's a way for women to like kind of put together a baby, like they choose sperm that will create a baby with like a specific color eyes, a specific color. What is that called? And like, what does the church teach about it?
Yeah, that would be some kind of designer baby creation. Yeah, that has to be done through in vitro fertilization. And what you're going to do is you're going to wind up with you have to have sperm donors over here, and then you're going to have egg donors. Well, let's say the woman wants to do this with her own egg. Okay. Well, her eggs have to be taken out. And again, so there's an invasive procedure that's not for her health. But then you have, on the other hand, where are the sperm coming from? Okay. So somewhere in the line, you've got people masturbating, which is intrinsically disordered too. And then you wind up, what happens is they'll take those sperm, and they always fertilize more than one egg, because in vitro fertilization, just like all these other things, there are all kinds of failures before you have a success. So let's say they fertilize 20 eggs, and then they implant 10, which is kind of the way it works a lot. I don't know exactly the numbers, but they wind up implanting more than they want because a lot of them won't take. And then what happens is if you have more than one take, they selectively abort. Okay? So, but when somebody doesn't selectively abort, well then you'll hear these stories about somebody having septuplets or whatever. When you hear that, that's because in vitro fertilization was almost certainly involved in those instances where people have 6, 7 babies at one time. And then they said, no, I don't want you selectively aborting. But selectively aborting is part of the routine of in vitro fertilization. So there are a number of places where there are things that are wrong with it. Now then the other problem is, what about the ones that weren't implanted? Here you have all these fertilized human eggs that are basically in storage, and what's going to become of them? And, you know, some of these are going to be earmarked for this type of procedure here. So it's human biological material being treated in an expendable way. So that's a chief problem with in vitro fertilization. Now we could go on and talk about the rights of the child, you know, to a father and a mother, to further see how even if you took out the masturbation, you took out the abortion, and you took out the problem of the fertilized eggs, it would still be morally problematic. So on numerous levels, it's a bad idea. A bad idea. And it's very, by the way, I know a lot of couples, they do in vitro fertilization these days. It's becoming extremely complicated. It's typically a long, emotionally draining, and very expensive process. I'll just put that out there too. Okay. Yes, sir.
If human cloning is illegal, why is it an issue?
Human cloning for reproductive purposes is illegal. Human cloning for embryonic stem cell is not.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me add, it's illegal in a number of states, but in some states it's legal. It's legal in California. Do you agree? It's legal in Missouri. Okay? And I can tell you why it's legal in Missouri, because I voted in that. They had a referendum, they brought it to the voters, and the people who were promoting it were incredibly evil, because they worded it such that it looked like if you said no, you would be voting against stem cell research. But in fact, it was all twisted, and even when you read the proposition, it was so convoluted in its wording that it was almost impossible to decipher. So they actually tricked people into voting for it when they actually wanted to vote against it. Now, I'm pretty sure that Missourians would not have voted that law in if they knew what was happening, but they were deceived by the language of the law. So in a number of places where it's come to referendum, you know, the citizens of the state have said no. But there are still a handful of states that actually allow it. Connecticut, I believe, I think Delaware might allow it, but definitely Missouri and California, a couple others.
What's the church's view on animal testing?
I don't think the church really has any problems with animal testing. You know, I mean, provided you're not just being mean for the sake of hearing them cry or something like that. Because it's a completely different. When you're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with creatures that are created for their own sakes, in the image of God, with a calling to be united with Him forever. So it's just a totally different level. The church is. I don't think I think you can search. I'm only guessing, but I'm thinking that you could probably search every document ever written by any churchman and not find anything against animal testing.
I was going to say, like, animal cloning isn't kind of playing God almost?
Yeah, the thing is, what you have to be careful, and that is mentioned in some of these documents. And what they say is, even there, one has to be really careful that it doesn't have negative implications. For example, if you're going to be if you're going to clone cows, right? You're going to take your best cows, the ones that are champion milkers, right? But what are you doing when you actually eliminate the natural diversity among the cows? That might have impacts that you don't know down the line. And you might wind up, it might be that you introduce genetic defects with the tampering. So even while it's been relatively successful, cloning of animals, again I say relative, most of them have defects that lead to their death at an early point, the ones that actually take. But even if you do have to be careful, really, really careful that what you're doing is not going to have an unexpected negative impact. But you would analyze that the way you would analyze, any act that in and of itself is not intrinsically disordered. Okay. It's kind of like throwing a rock. I'm going to go in my backyard and I'm just going to throw a rock as far as I can. Is that evil? Well, it is if I throw it in the direction of the neighbor's baby who's in a bassinet. So it's kind of like that. You have to think of the consequences of what's going to happen. Okay, like my example? That's great.